We're here today to talk about sharing data across the nation to build a stronger network. And the other half of the party here is Shanna, so I'll hand it over to her.
Hi guys, how are you? So like she said, we are going to hopefully talk about the communication and the sharing of data across the entire Excel Center network. So sometimes it's really easy to get focused on kind of what you're doing in your kind of area or your state. And so hopefully we're going to kind of think about ways to share that on a bigger picture. So in just a second, we'll introduce ourselves a little bit better. But the idea here, and here's the session agenda that you guys can see, is to really talk about how we're both similar and different. And so a lot of times it's easy to really think like, oh, we're all Excel centers, we're all doing the same thing. And as we're going to point out, we are all doing the same thing, but sometimes that just looks a little different in where we are. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Missouri. Rachel will talk a little bit about what's happening in central and southern Indiana. And then we're going to all come together and talk about the National Data Committee and what we're doing as a committee to hopefully kind of help us all get on the same page and just be more efficient and more effective in sharing data and kind of tracking outcomes and measuring success. So Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure, hi. So I'm Rachel Zadke, and I am the manager of business support here at the Goodwills of Central and Southern Indiana. The Goodwill Central and Southern Indiana. And I started back at Indianapolis Metropolitan High School as an instructor there. So that was the first school that then led to the Excel Centers. As we learned there was a need for adult education so that those students at IndyNet could have parents that had an opportunity to go back and get an education as well, if needed. So yeah, this is my 10th year within the organization. And now I do all things kind of data related, mostly for schools, but also some of the grant work and things like that as reporting goes. Shanna.
All right, so like we said, my name is Shanna Parmley. I have actually been with Goodwill for 5 years. So prior to working in the Excel centers and prior to coming to Goodwill, I was actually a probation and parole officer. So I worked for the state of Missouri, and I supervised people that were either on probation and parole. And so once I came to Goodwill, I actually ran our federal and state halfway house. And I was the director of each of those. And so one of the reasons that I was super excited to switch over to the Excel Center is because so many of the people that I was supervising, I was trying to help them. And I would say, you know, you need to get a job, you need to pay these fines. But at the end of the day, they didn't have the education to do that. And a lot of them, the HiSET or the GED, like that just wasn't something that was going to work out for them for a lot of reasons. And so I started with our Excel Centers when we first opened them. And initially I was our registrar and kind of transitioned over. And so now I'm the director of student services and data analytics. So basically I do a bunch of number stuff. So kind of similar to Rachel, just helping track and kind of figure out, you know, what's happening here, what we're doing great, maybe what are things that we can improve on a little bit. So that's what I do. I think our next kind of introductions, we were initially thinking that we wanted everybody to introduce themselves, and then we realized that would take us quite some time, but we do want to give an opportunity for anybody that's on this session. We know there are some from the National Data Committee. If you guys just want to say hi really quick and introduce yourself super fast, we wanted to give you guys an opportunity to do that as well. Anybody want to go first?
I'll go. Hi, I'm Katie Bustamante. I'm the Regional Director of the Excel Center National Office, and I get to be on the National Data Committee with these lovely ladies.
Hi, I'm Greg Wertenberger, and I'm the Director of the Excel Center in Little Rock, Arkansas.
I'm Cleela Palmer. I'm a School Development Director, and I'm happy to be on the National Data Committee.
Anybody else? I think there's a couple others that we thought might be on here, but no? Okay, if we missed you, we'll get you at the end. You can introduce your do really quick is I'm just going to go through some of the stuff for Missouri or for MERS and talk to you a little bit about just who we are, who do we serve, how do we measure success. I'm not going to get into any of the super specifics of that just because I know it doesn't apply to everybody across the board, but what we're hoping to do is just kind of point out some similarities and differences between us. So as you're listening to this, even if you're not in Missouri, you may be able to go like, oh yeah, we do that. Or, oh yeah, we do that just a little differently. So who we are, so we are actually the newest district to the network. So we have 4 schools in Missouri. We opened the first 3 in October of 18. So that was St. Louis, Poplar Bluff, and Springfield. And then a year later, we opened Columbia. So we have 4 schools in our state. For those of you that are not super familiar with Missouri, St. Louis, most of you probably know St. Louis. So St. Louis is our kind of big city school. Our medium-sized schools would be Springfield and Columbia. And then Poplar Bluff is our smaller school, and it's our more rural school. So it's in our kind of more rural area. One thing initially that makes us super different than most everybody else is that we are considered a nonprofit. Or, I'm sorry, we're all nonprofit. We're a non-public school, so we do not follow a charter like a lot of the other schools. There are actually some restrictions and some limitations in our state for charter schools. And so outside of St. Louis City and Kansas City, charter schools were not really an option. And so we knew going into this that we wanted to be able to expand. We didn't just want a school in St. Louis. We wanted to be able to kind of spread out across our state. There's definitely a need there. And so going the charter route was not an option. And so we are fully accredited by MNSAA. And so I gave you the kind of whole long name there also, but that is one thing that initially makes us super different. So when we talk about tracking data and things that we have to report on, we are very different in that regard. And so in some ways that's a good thing, and in some ways that brings some other challenges as well. So the next slide is just going to be who we serve. So again, this is where you start seeing some similarities and differences. So our residents have to, or our students all have to be residents of Missouri, and they all have to be at least 21 years old. So our students have to be 21 and up. And even so, like in St. Louis, the river is right next to us. On the other side of the river is Illinois. But if they don't live in Missouri, they can't kind of come to school with us. And that sounds pretty harsh, but it has to do with our funding and how that is set up. And so because our funding is through Missouri, even though they live very, very close to us, they can't come to school here if they're not a Missouri resident and over the age of 21. The reasoning behind that age when we kind of set this up is because we didn't want to be seen as competition for any of the regular kind of schools or through DESE, any of the other programs that are available in Missouri. We didn't want to be seen as like the new people that are competing. And so we picked that 21 and up age. The majority of our students are in their 20s and 30s. The average age right now this term is 35. So it's a little bit older for us than it is in some other terms. But 35 is where we're sitting right now. Students are female. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that we see that kind of across the board. And so in our national data committee, we're kind of talking about why is that? Does that have to do with how we recruit? Does it have to do with how our program is structured? That is a pretty common theme that we've kind of noticed. And so, yeah, we fall in line with that. Most of our students are female. Our demographics vary from school to school. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I think you guys could all probably look at your states and realize that that is probably true for you too. So depending on whether you're looking at your school that may be in more of a rural area or kind of your bigger city schools, demographics change a lot for those two things. But across the board, we know that most of our students are female and in the 20s to 30 range. So we're also going to talk about how we measure success. And I feel like this is where we really start to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of things. So on the left side here, you see all of our accountability measures or the legislative measures. So for us in Missouri, we have 4 ways that we're really graded, if you want to kind of put it in real simple academic terms. And so over on the left side, you're going to see all of those. And so this is when you kind of start to see like, oh yeah, we do things sort of similar to that, but maybe just in a different way. So for our legislation, we have to talk about persistence. And so we want to see when somebody comes to school with us and they attend for the first time, within the next 5 terms, do they attend at least one more term? And so we don't want people to come one time and then, never see them again. We want them to follow through, but we do know that some of our students start and stop and come back and all of those things. So we basically give them 5 terms and hopefully we're going to see them at least 2 of those terms and not 5. Obviously, hopefully all 5 would be like the best, but we want at least 75% of our students to persist and go on to at least one more term. We also talk about IRCs or industry recognized certification in higher education. So another area that we are that we have to track that we're looking at is our graduates. And so we want them to attain an IRC or enroll in higher education or advanced skills training. And they need to do that within 6 months of graduation. So for our graduates, at least 50% of them need to go on to do one of those 2 things. We also talk about employment. So if you don't go on to higher education or to get an IRC, we want you to be employed within 6 months of graduation. And so for that group of people, we want 85% of them to fall into that being able to obtain employment within 6 months of graduation. And then the last piece there, so we don't want them to obtain just any employment. We want them to have meaningful, productive employment. And so we need them to have a wage rate at least 20% higher than the average Missouri wage rate for individuals without a high school diploma. So basically, if you don't have your high school diploma in Missouri, we know you make about $11.76 an hour. And we want you to be over 120%, or we want you to have 120% of that. So what that ends up being is like $14.11 or 12 cents, depending on how you round, an hour. And so we track all of those things. And so those are the things that we're required to track. We have to report. It's in our legislation. It's kind of that non-negotiable, like these are things that we have to measure. But we also know that those alone don't talk about how well we may or may not be doing. And so we could either be nailing all of those things and still struggling in areas, or maybe we missed one of those because of something like COVID that we didn't plan for, but it doesn't mean that we're not being successful. It doesn't mean that we're not still really doing a great job in serving our students. So we also have some internal measures that we do. And so one of those things that we measure, kind of here's the list on the right side, student conversion rates. So we spend so much time recruiting and doing intakes, trying to get students into us. And we want to see that that's productive. So we look at how many students are going through that process, and then how many students go on to sit in class at least one time. And so that's our student conversion rate. And again, we feel like that really speaks to, I mean, we spend a lot of time and effort kind of doing that. We want to make sure that we're measuring those things, even though our legislators don't really care what that number is.
A lot from my
I think you're cutting out just a little bit. No? All right, I'm gonna keep going and then we'll get it in a minute. We also wanna track the average number of classes taken. So this helps us when we talk about like expanding and growing and how things are kind of trending. It doesn't necessarily just help to say that we have 500 students in St. Louis, but like how many classes are those 500 students taking? If they're taking one, that looks very different for us than if they're taking 4 each. And so we track that. We also track the number of graduates per term. And again, I think that's something that we would all say like, yeah, of course we do that. We do student surveys. So between terms, we don't know how things are going. So we ask the students questions about like, do you feel respected in your class? Do you feel like you were given opportunity to show kind of what you know in a variety of ways? Do you feel like you understood what was being asked of you and how you can actually get a good grade in the class? And so we try to evaluate ourselves, again, not just on the things on the left side of the screen, but just kind of internally, like how's it going for us? And then the last thing on here, and of course we measure a ton of other things, but again, we don't want to like bore you with all the details of what we do, but just kind of qualitative measures. So when they first come in, we ask them things about housing insecurity and food insecurity. You know, have you ever been hungry and not been able to get food? Have you ever been homeless and not known where you were going to live? We look at all of those things. And then we also track those after graduation. And so hopefully the idea is as they go through this process with us, we've been able to help them, one, not just get their high school diploma, but two, get a meaningful job where they're hopefully not feeling kind of all those same stressors that maybe they were when they first came in. And so we measure a lot of qualitative stuff too, because that's really the story, right? That helps us kind of know that we're successful in a way that maybe just the legislative measures don't always show. And also, I know a lot of us have talked about like even funding, like sometimes when you're talking to funders, like they want the story, like they want to know kind of the big picture, and they also want kind of all the little feel good pieces of that too. And so that's how we kind of track those. And then the last piece for me, and then I'm going to pass it over to Rachel, is how do we track this? So it sounds super great to say we're going to track all the things, but at the end of the day, like, how do we do this? So we use Synergy, which is the same system that Indiana uses. So we just kind of said when we were new, like, we don't know, what do you guys do? And so we use that system too. So that's our student information system. We also use Excel and Google Sheets. Like that doesn't sound glamorous at all, but honestly, we track so much stuff through Excel and Google and depend on that a lot. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about, and again, we'll do it kind of briefly, but Mimers is a custom web-based platform that we use. And this is something that's sort of unique to us. And it's not necessarily something that everybody else is going to go duplicate immediately, but it's just hopefully going to give you an idea to like think creatively. So for us, this is actually used agency-wide. So we use it in Voc Rehab, we use it for loss prevention, our retail team uses it, but so does our Excel centers. And so it's something that definitely I'm not taking credit for. Like our IT team developed it. I know how to use it and run it, but this is totally our IT team. But they came to us and basically said, hey, we have this platform, it might be able to help you guys. And so now the Excel centers use it for a variety of things. So this is how we manage our inquiries. So when someone goes online and says, hey, I'm interested in the Excel Center, they get dumped into this database. And this is how we start tracking those people that have expressed interest. From there, once they come in and they do intake, they sit down with us, we get them entered in Synergy, our student information system. And then once they're there, this system helps talk to our Google platform. And this is how we're going to generate their Google account. So they get their Gmail account here. Once they've done that, the system goes on to send them an enrollment survey. So this is kind of a newer piece for us. They get this enrollment survey, and that's that pre-enrollment survey to say, kind of, where are you with things in the beginning? Because these are the same things we're going to measure on the back end. And so then once they graduate, we're able to send a text to them that says, hey, go into your email, and they answer all these survey questions. And so we have all of that data in one place. So we're not trying to piece that together later. It all is housed in our MyMers platform. We also have the ability to take attendance with this. So they can come in, we'll have a QR code on the back of their badges when we're not doing everything virtually, and they can scan in and it'll track when they've scanned in, what class, what time, all of that. And then obviously the bigger picture here is just that it stores and tracks data for us. And so again, hopefully this just gets you thinking about maybe some things that you already have. This is a platform that was not created just for Excel, but it's something that we have been able to use as an agency platform that we're like, oh yeah, we can totally make this work for us too. And so hopefully just getting you guys to think creatively about maybe what do you have kind of sitting in your organization already that you can utilize and take advantage of. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rachel, unless you guys have specific questions for me right now. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of this also. No? Okay, I'm going to let Rachel take over.
Just trying to give that ample wait time. So Shanna already knows how jealous I am of the MyMers functionality, because the first time she told me about it, I was quite envious. But at Goodwill Central and Southern Indiana, this is who we are. We kind of write, I think Shanna touched on it, but we initially had hoped to kind of share some insight on every territory's sort of internal tracking and data points and things like that. And then we quickly realized that 50 minutes wouldn't be enough time. So we wanted to highlight Missouri as the newest, and then we of course are the oldest in the district, and we have 15 schools across our central and southern Indiana region. The first is our Michigan Street location, which opened in 2010, and then our most recent site is in Bloomington, which opened in 2019. So that Michigan Street location, along with the 5 others in Indianapolis, are authorized by the Mayor's Office of Education Innovation, or OEI. And then the other 9 schools in the surrounding areas are authorized by the Indiana Charter School Board, or ICSB. So in addition to our accountability and funding metrics, we also have those fine folks to answer to with different items each month and things like that. And then all of our schools operate as public charter schools. So the students we serve are similar to like Missouri, Indiana residents, and we have minimum ages that kind of vary from school to school, some as low as 16 with parent or guardian permission. And then the majority of our students are between the ages of 25 and 39, and the average age is 27. And like Shanna pointed out, most of our students across the nation are female. So we are in line with that statistic as well. And then the other demographics, again, vary from school to school, which is demonstrated by our equity data. And I don't know if any of you are attending that session later today, but you'll see what that kind of looks like across the board as well. And then we get into kind of how we measure success. So there's the accountability and the funding piece. So grad rate is big, CCR rate, which is that college and career readiness. So of the number of students that graduate, how many of them have that post-secondary credential that's going to help them either get a high-paying career or, to post-secondary education. And then the other piece that we look at is enrollment. And of course, that's based on records of attendance and academic engagement throughout their time with us. And then internal measures, obviously, as mentioned, attendance is big, and that academic engagement piece, which is just any kind of documentation to show that the student is academically active with us. So earning credits, making progress in a course, spending time in our online learning platform, that kind of stuff. And then of course, grads is something that we're constantly tracking. And then credit attainment. Dual credits and certifications are big, and it's been an interesting year with COVID to see how that shift has kind of happened in the amount of dual credits earned versus certifications. And then equity is another piece that we have begun to track more closely in a more refined fashion. And then post-grad outcomes, kind of like Shanna mentioned, right? We have those intake surveys to see where students are when they start with us, and then the post-grad outcomes to see how their time with us has helped them and kind of that what comes next piece. So we'll do that with those student surveys mentioned there at the bottom. And we have one in our senior seminar course as well to see how they did or how they felt during their time with us. And then again, post-grad. And then when we look at how we track data, Synergy is our student information system, just like Shannon mentioned in Missouri. And then we also have a plethora of Excel and Google Sheets that we use. And then Domo is our data visualization tool, and that houses some information for various GCSI programs, including the Excel centers. And then because of those surveys, we have Alchemer, that's our software platform for surveys. And then Odysseyware is what we use for those credit recovery and online learning courses. So that's a really quick rundown. Does anyone have questions for me specifically on that before we jump into how these very different but also similar data pieces relate? Well, let's jump into the National Data Committee. So the first thing I wanted to make sure we pointed out was the goal of this National Data Committee, which is to identify and leverage national level data to drive decision making, to celebrate, to solve problems, to hold ourselves accountable, and to provide support and to scale. So that's our big goal. And I want to pause here, if that's okay, to see if we missed anybody from the National Data Committee that since joined the team and wants to say hello. Anybody out there? Nobody knew? Okay, thanks, Katie. Okay, well, I do want to mention, I have their names. So Chuck from Memphis is on the team with us, Teresa from Texas, we have Caitlin from Shanna, Shanna obviously, and then Greg from Arkansas introduced himself, thank you. Mark from Missouri also, and then Dimitri from DC are some of the other folks on the team, amongst some others. But yeah, the other piece I wanted to point out too is just sort of where we are at this point in time. So as Shannon mentioned already, we've kind of developed some statistics. So we know, for example, that the bulk of our students are female across the nation, but we've also spent some time gathering all of those accountability and funding metrics that each territory is tracking. And then what we've done is compiled that all together and identified kind of what some of those common themes are. So based on that, we'll continue to build and find some common language to help us better communicate with each other and also track within our own territories and across the nation, the data that's going to best support all of our students. And then, Shanna, what am I missing? Anything you want to add on that piece?
I think one thing to kind of think about, and sometimes when I tell people like what I do, it sounds sort of boring, right? Like a whole bunch of numbers and data. But I think if you're not on this data committee, one of the things to really think about is like, what would you like us to look at? So maybe you don't have to be the one kind of digging into the numbers, but there's some real practical things here too. So again, like graduation rates and things like that, like obviously we have to track that, and we're going to track that within our own schools and kind of how that looks. But when we talk about the majority of our students being female across the board, so like, what does that mean for us? And so as a committee, we can kind of start looking into those things and saying like, okay, so does that mean anything for how we recruit? Or does that mean anything for how we structure our classes or our schedules or things like that? And so hopefully the idea here is not that we're just all kind of sitting around looking at data, but that we're coming up with some really meaningful things that then you can take back to your school that's very practical for you. And so one of the things that we've also talked about is like what's easy to track and what's difficult to track. And so sometimes it's really easy to say like, oh yeah, that sounds like a great thing to track. And then when you go back to it, and I'm like the worst, I'll look at Synergy and say like, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. I have no idea how to actually do that. And the National Data Committee can kind of come together to say like, okay, we would love to track this. We don't really know how to kind of start that process. you guys are tracking something similar. So how does that work? And so maybe you're in a position at your school or your building to say, like, we would love to do this. We just don't know kind of where to go with it. And on the national level, we can kind of look to each other to say, like, okay, somebody else is doing that. Help us kind of figure out which direction we should go in. And again, we kind of mentioned just like the language and the verbiage. Sometimes we are kind of all doing the same thing, but we all call it something different. And so it's really easy to kind of overlook that. And so that's one piece that we're trying to kind of touch on. The last thing I think that comes to mind for me is sometimes, and I'll use Missouri as an example, it's really easy to look at our 4 schools and compare things, but we know that Poplar Bluff and St. Louis are so different. And not to say that one's better than the other, like just geographically, we're very different. And so our students are different. And so the National Data Committee gives us the opportunity to compare data to schools that are more similar. And so we don't have any schools in our state that are just like Poplar Bluff, but there are some as far as like size and demographics and things like that across kind of our national network that are pretty similar. And so maybe Poplar Bluff is doing great at some things, but maybe there are other things that might be a struggle. And so figuring out, you know, are there other schools that we can look to for advice, not just looking internally? And so we're hoping that that is also a, my phone was not on do not disturb, so sorry guys. So we're hoping that's also kind of a benefit of this, is that again, we can just kind of rely on each other because we are such a big group, and sometimes it feels like we're just all doing our own thing, but we have the potential to really kind of tap into a lot of different options. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing I would add to that.
Yeah, I think my favorite part has just been the ability to communicate with everyone across the nation about all of the data that we're collecting and then make it useful, right? Because we're all doing it a little differently, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to help those students get, you know, to that what comes next step so that they have what they need to increase their opportunities in the future. So I think this has been really neat to do. And I know we've even come up with some new terms, right? Like grad ratio rather than grad rate maybe. And then obviously grad is a theme kind of across the network as well. So I think it's been neat to see some of that. And then also kind of similar to the goal of this presentation is to hopefully just open those lines of communication so that we're not operating in these silos. And obviously we are all doing things a little differently, but we're also still trying to serve the same mission, right? So that's kind of helping us maybe lead to that next piece here, which is opening up for questions that you all might have for us or items you would like to see discussed at the National Data Committee and things like that. So to help with that, we do have some questions because, you know, everyone likes that sometimes, right? So first off, we're wondering from a role specific perspective, what information do you track or what information are you most interested in? Feel like being put on the spot, volunteers?
It looks like there might be a couple thoughts in the chat. I don't know if they want to say them out loud.
I guess I'll go.
Thank you.
One, like I mentioned in the chat, was I'm very interested in finding out the interest or the amount of students that are African American Latinx males that are here and like the length of time they are here, what had them to drop out. And then another one that I was going to put in was before the pandemic, what are the most common barriers that our students deal with? And what are, I guess, what are some of the things that we're able to help with in regards to those?
I'd like to see on a national scale, because I think it's interesting that all the schools are predominantly female. So just looking at the data to show like nationally, do more females just naturally drop out of school compared to males? And if not, then like what are the reasonings that cause females to come back to school to finish their diploma versus males?
I brought this up in another data group, but this idea that we have like I said in the chat, we seem to have two groups of people. We have grads and then people who don't graduate. And so what are these students coming in with? And that means not just soft skills, but it just means what tangible things do they have that we can track and record, and then better support these guys the minute they walk in the door, because we know what a grad looks like. We know what a grad has. And I'm guessing there might be some certain telltale signs and things we can help with to up our retention and our graduation rates in that way. That's what I would like to see.
I would be interested in seeing tracking of how special education students do after they graduate. If, when we are able to get them to graduate as a separate entity, how does that change? And I'd like more information about that, because I know nationally, special ed students who graduate from high school tend to not do as well as non-disabled peers. And so I would be very interested in knowing more about how do ours compare, since the certification is a requirement.
JD, do you want to add something?
Well, I just wanted to ask, I was thinking about, I think what Sal mentioned, and I'm wondering if any of the Excel centers do some sort of exit interview, or if life coaches do something for those students who don't come back. I can tell you that we hear all the time from our life coaches, they never worry that students won't come back because they take off for a variety of reasons. Something happens and they want to come back next term. And we do feel like we get a lot, but I don't know if we have that actual data to back what I'm saying, but I wonder if anybody's actually doing like exit interview might not be the right term, but some kind of interview with those students who do leave and why. Because we aren't, but maybe somebody is.
I have a question. I guess when we're tracking the data and we're looking at things, especially the minority males and things like that, what are the influencers for you to track that data? Because, we have to look at things where they're coming from. The systematic racism didn't just start today or yesterday or last week. Are we looking at those variables that are not just with that Excel student, but what was there prior to? What caused this person not to graduate? Maybe it's not necessarily the student. Could be the environment that we're in, when we don't see people who look like them or themselves, So there's many factors. I'm not solving the world here right now, but I'm just saying, when we're looking at those type of data things, a lot of things play key, and we can't just necessarily focus as if the student can, there's a barrier that was built, and who was it built by, and what caused it. And, for us to exist, if that makes sense.
I think that's a great point, and kind of in line with what everyone's saying. There's a lot to unfold with all of it, and so nothing is super clear cut and simple, because we're working with people, and people just aren't that kind of linear. But it is helpful to kind of get an idea of what everybody's interested in, and that's a good point. Like, we do ask them some questions in Missouri about like, why didn't high school work out for you the first time? So like, what caused you to drop out or leave the first go round? And so that's something that we do, but it may not be something that everyone does. But if this is something across like our network that we feel like would be really helpful information, then it's not to say that everybody has to duplicate what we're doing, but we could ask those questions in a way that we not only are going to be able to reflect on like what our state is doing or what our area is doing, but across the board. So then that way it is more meaningful. There is more data to look at and say like, okay, across the board, we're finding this. And so it's really helpful in like jotting all these ideas down. So then we can go back and, we like data, obviously, that's what we're doing as a job. So we're all interested in it. But it's not very helpful if it's not something that then you can take back and utilize some way. So it's really helpful that you guys are kind of giving us all these ideas, and I'm sure Rachel's writing them down too. So we appreciate them. Somebody just said in the chat, tracking of alumni that are 50 plus. Latoya, do you want to add, is there something specific you want to track about that group of people, or?
I guess just more so like what they are doing, and if they're like, I guess even more terms of employability and how their earning their high school diploma, that's how that helps them, because they are, senior citizen age or coming up to that age, and so it looks different from them. So just wondering, once they do graduate, it's kind of like that. Then what?
Something I'd love to be able to, for us to do too, and this is probably a bigger project, but as everyone starts looking at different data pieces, and as we continue to grow and we add new territories, and each new territory brings its own pieces of data and things to be tracking, especially per their authorizer, it'd be interesting to find a way to house all of these different things in one place so that we can all go into access. So if I'm in Kentucky and I open an Excel center and I have something kind of nuanced that Indiana doesn't track, I can go and say, oh, Missouri tracks it, I'll reach out to them, or something that just kind of brings all of this together in a way. I know that we could spend, obviously we've already listed several things that we could be tracking just in this meeting alone. So it'd be pretty extensive, but a place where we could all keep it in one spot, I think would be neat.
This is great, you guys. I appreciate it. If you see me looking at a different screen, it's because I'm trying to fiercely type out the rest of what everyone is saying here so we can capture it all. And I see some really great stuff in the chat now, but I love that idea of the alumni network, right? To try and keep track of grads and keep them engaged with each other and with the networks. Any other thoughts that come to mind? Anything from a site-specific level that you all are tracking or that you would like to see tracked? So I think maybe just in your building, is there something that you see anecdotally that you might like to see tracked at a national level? Let's see if it holds, if it's supported with the data or not.
I'll chime in again. I think something that I would love to see at the national level that I would love to see tracked is finding a way for us to more consistently track outcome data, whether that be like placements or wage data or anything that just shows our greater impact after students graduate. I know we all collect it in different ways, but it's fairly different from place to place. So finding a way to do that consistently, I think would be really helpful and really beneficial as we move forward.
I think Notre Dame is doing that a little bit, Katie. Is that right? Or
yeah, within Indiana.
Okay.
So Notre Dame's doing different studies on each of the different territories, but each study is slightly different.
Gotcha.
It was all the same.
Yeah.
I think I would add, I think most of us are kind of tracking it in some capacity. Really the age group and how the applicants in specific age groups hear about the Excel Center. I know a lot of that is market specific, but I wonder if there's not strands and mediums that we can all kind of get around and identify a way to easier access to students, because we all know it's word of mouth, but there's got to be a better way. So just interested in that.
One thing that I would also like to see in a national basis is the age limit. For example, with Missouri being 21 and Indianapolis being 16, don't know what it is in Texas. I'm may have family or a network that I'm a part of that are in Texas or in the DC area. What are the age limits? So, we may be able to bring that out as well. And also, what are some of the certifications? Are certifications a big piece in other places? So I guess the things that we have, I guess, at the home front, is it similar to in the national spectrum?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense too, because right, part of the goal is to be able to help people across the nation connect with each other. So if you see that another school has a similar population to what you have, then what are they doing to see more success in a certain category than you might be seeing where you are and things like that. So like certifications and stuff. It's a good example. Anything else that comes to mind that you all would like to see or have more questions about?
I have a question, but it's not super data related. You just made me think of it since you brought it up, or since someone brought it up, but are there any attendees today, Katie, in this conference that are from states that may be thinking about opening an Excel Center and haven't yet? And if so, what are those states?
Yes, there are several that are in the process. I'd have to go back and look at the list. There may be some in this session if they want to introduce themselves. I'll have to go through. But yeah, there are several that are going through feasibility studies and are currently in legislation to hopefully get one up and running.
I know I keep tying it back to the National Data Committee, you all, but the other part of the work is to try and get some of this entry level data figured out so that people know what works best with different legislation and things like that, so that new sites or sites that are expanding are able to do so with a little less legwork, I guess. It's a good question.
I did see one other question in the chat box a little bit earlier. I got a couple questions asking about the committee and if it's open to all Excel Center staff, or how can people be a part of the committee if that's possible?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button for a moment, but I might turn this one over to Katie. Or Dan if he's on, but I mean, we have included, I'm sorry, at the end of the presentation here, our contact information so that you all can get in touch with Shanna or myself with any questions or concerns or things you'd like to communicate with the committee about. But also as far as participation goes, I'm going to throw it over to Katie, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Yes, I would say first, if anyone on this call is interested, definitely reach out to Shanna and Rachel in terms of following up with things that we've talked about. But in terms of representation on the data committee, we're trying to keep it to one person from each territory, but every territory is represented. So what I would say is if you have input, if you want to be a part of meetings, if you know all of that, go through your territory's contact, just because they'll be the person who knows the most about what's going on and where the steps are, just so we have really clear communication lines. But obviously we want input and we want the entire network to feel a part of this. So the more that you can meet with your representative, the better. And if you need that contact information, we can definitely send that out so everybody knows who their territory's person is.
I think we're almost out of time. So just sort of as like a take home, and I know we've said this a million times, so look, a lot of great things have come up and we've written them down and typed them out and all of that, and we'll take them back to the committee. Obviously, none of those things are going to have answers like tomorrow. If those were like simple things to sort of figure out, I feel like we probably would have already done that. But it's definitely a great place to start thinking and kind of guiding us and kind of what our next steps are going to be and what things we can look at. But again, like they had just mentioned, when within your schools or within your districts, if there's things that you really are interested in, or even if you think like, hey, we might be interested in this, I wonder if anybody else is doing it, just making sure that you know that this committee is a resource and a tool, and we definitely want it to be something that is super usable. And so we want to produce kind of data that you can take back and do things with. And the only way to ensure that we're actually looking at things that are super helpful, like we can come up with a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it's going to be kind of each of you and your schools to know like what you're really hoping to have data on to make better decisions or to be able to help students. And so please, please, please reach out to us. And if we're not the person, we could definitely put you in touch with the person that maybe can answer some of those questions. But we want this to just be a stepping stone, not like, oh, a session that I just sat through and got some information, but we want this to sort of be the beginning of some really great communication across all of our schools across the nation. Anybody have any last minute questions or things for us at all?
Does anyone just want to talk about how much they love data? No? Numbers?
I was super impressed that we had this many attendees for this session, because data doesn't always make people super excited, but we were very excited to have all of you guys join us.
We were. Thanks, everybody. That's awesome.
All right. I think that's all for us for now. Stay in touch with us, and thank you so much for hanging out with us for a little while.